Welcome. First, I'd like to thank those of you joining today to the webinar. Today's topic is training plans, and it's our second topic in this series. And what we're going to focus on here is risk management within training plans. Like, when I'm making a training plan, how do I start assessing risk, and then how do I plan risk into that practice session that you're going to do? So those are some things that we're going to be taking a look at. And again, this is our second second webinar within this series, and every 2 weeks we're just going to kind of build on, how we make training plans and what are some things that we need to think about as we go through that process. As we get started here, one thing, just a quick apology. You'll probably hear a sound go off every so often, and that's I'm currently at school, and so as we have passing periods and as the kids are moving from place to place within the building, you'll hear some sounds, as that bell rings. So to get started, our first thing is I have this quote, and I really, really like this quote. I think it really sums up a lot of what this is about here. The first step in the risk management process is to acknowledge the reality of risk. Denial is a common tactic that substitutes deliberate ignorance for thoughtful planning. The first thing we have to do when we're looking at risk management and putting that into a training plan and factoring that in is we have to acknowledge that there is risk. There's risk associated, with the sport in general, but in certain activities that we do. And we need to be able to look for that. We can't go into denial like, oh, that this isn't going to happen. We need to acknowledge that there is risk. And then by planning and thoughtful planning, we can really reduce what that risk is. And that's really what I'm going to focus on here today, is looking at, by how we can think about what are some areas that we need to consider as we go through this. We can plan and help, reduce that risk that we have associated with it. But we can't deny that there's risk there. We just have to look for it and then plan effectively for that. One of our earlier webinars that we had the last series we had going, we talked about, risk management was one of those topics. And we had this chart up as we went through. And I thought I'd go through it quickly and review when we're looking at this, how does this work? And so the first thing when we have this is we have to identify risk. And as a coach, you have to really be looking for ways in where, potential injuries or their safety concerns that may exist. And the first step is identifying it, being able to see it. And what we're going to look at today is how can we think about it ahead of time and then plan that into our session. All right. So once we've identified risk, the second thing we have to look at is what's called the cost of risk reduction. And the cost of risk reduction isn't so much that it costs money to reduce the risk, it certainly could. But more or less what this is what do you have to give up in order to reduce the risk? Because if you're going to reduce the risk or eliminate it, or to some extent, you have to give up something to make that happen. And is it possible to do that? And also we have to factor in, what's the level, as mentioned, there's risk that's associated with every part of the sport, but is the risk, the potential for injury, is it potential for a big injury? Is it potential for just, if an injury does occur, it's going to be pretty small? Those are things we have to take into account. And then once we've analyzed this part, this is where the risk reduction matrix comes into play. This is the diagram that you see here, is where does it fall in these areas? Does it fall in the green as low risk, or is it manageable, or is it what we consider non-acceptable risk? And once we've determined where that falls, we then have to look at our next thing, because we really have three choices when we're assessing and working with risk as part of risk management here. Is we either have to do risk avoidance, and risk avoidance is simply, we're just not even going to do this because we're going to avoid this process or avoid this drill or avoid this activity because it's a high level of risk, and there's really not a good way to either reduce the risk or the cost to reduce it is too great. So we're just going to avoid it. I can tell you from coaching, there's a game that I used to play, an activity that when I first started coaching 20 years ago, we would do it, 2 or 3 times during the course of a season. And what I found is as I progressed through this, like there was always injuries. Not only was there injuries, but some of the injuries were pretty serious. And as I looked back, I was like, you know what? We're never playing that game again. I'm just going to avoid it altogether. I'll figure out something to do fun wise, activity wise for those wrestlers, but I'm just going to avoid it altogether. So that's risk avoidance. Another one is risk acceptance. That's just you as a coach, you have to just look and say, you know what? I understand the risk that's with that. There's really not a good way that I can reduce it. That risk is just going to be there. And you have to maybe it's a low level risk. And so as a result of that, you know, you're just going to accept it and go ahead and move forward. So that's risk acceptance. You just accept it, you move forward, understanding what could potentially happen as a result. And then the part I really want to look at and probably focus on more is that risk reduction piece. Like, how can we reduce the risk, you know, for our athletes? And that's exactly, risk reduction is just looking for ways to mitigate that and to lower that level. Not that you're going to completely eliminate it, but by what you do as a coach, you can certainly reduce that. And that's what we're going to be going through mostly today, is looking at how can we assess it? You know, how can we, assess the risk? Then how can we plan accordingly with that? And then what are some strategies to help to reduce the risk? So that's what we taking a look at as I go through the webinar today is looking at those areas. And we'll kind of look at those areas sometimes collectively as a group, because there are certain things we need to consider. And when we consider those, how do we assess it before practice? Like just starting to think about it before you even get to the practice session. We want to already be thinking about what are those things that could potentially cause injuries or safety concerns. How do we plan, how do we effectively plan a training plan or make a practice plan to help reduce the risk? And then we're going to look at some strategies that can help you do that. The first one here is documenting risk on the plans. You know, as I mentioned before, you know, wrestling is a combat sport, and there's a certain level of risk that always comes with participating. But there are some drills, there's some games, there's some techniques that have that possibility for potential injuries, and we need to be able to identify those early. And when we identify those, we want to document that on your plan. I think that's a really key aspect here of starting to reduce the risk, is one, to make sure that you have it written clearly on your practice plan when you walk in to run the practice. You know, because one thing that comes up is when you're conducting training sessions, there are often many distractions. You know, things happen, wrestlers are doing one thing, you're trying to navigate a lot of different things as a coach. And by having it written on your practice plan, this is just going to help you build in reminders. That way you can communicate it to the wrestlers. You know, but by having it on there, that's going to help you remember it, because there's so many things that take place during practice that it's very easy to get distracted and then to forget to tell them, like, oh yeah, I thought about it. But by having it written down, you're more likely to remember it, because you'll look down, you'll see it, and then you'll be able to do the next part, which here is, you know, instruct them on how to avoid the injuries. You know, I know that sometimes when we talk about, like, I'll write down, like, we'll be doing a drill that involves like a double leg drill where we hip heist out, and then we are going to, you know, take and fire a double leg takedown, a blast double. And as a result of it, you know, I have to make sure I talk to the wrestlers who are making the attack to make sure that they keep their head up when they shoot. And I also have to talk to the defensive wrestler to make sure, because one thing we're doing is we're doing a shot fake, or actually we're doing a shot fake. They have to sprawl. When they come back up, I'm like, you have to raise your head. You have to lift up so that they can get under you. If not, they're coming probably right through your face. So I make sure that I document that on the practice plan. So that way that I make sure I remember to tell them that, because I don't want to forget that and just take it for granted. And it's also important to document it on practice plans as well, because what happens if, as a coach, you're not able to go to practice? Something comes up and somebody has to step in and fill in for you at practice. They may or may not know what that drill is, and they're just following straight down. But if they have it listed on here, that's going to be a reminder to them to make sure that they help them, instruct them to avoid the injuries. So one thing I would highly encourage when you're making your practice plan is look for areas of potential risks and how you can reduce it, and list those on the practice plan directly. The next one here is properly planned activities. Coaches must determine skills and techniques in the activities that they're going to use during each practice. Like, that's the coach's job, is to figure out what you're going to do, what order you're going to do it in. One of those first areas that you have to start to consider is this appropriate for the wrestler's developmental stage? Not so much is it for their age group, but is it for their developmental stage? At practice, a coach has a responsibility as you go through, is to be able to identify what stage their wrestlers are at. I can tell you that in my practice room right now, like, we have 3 different group levels of athletes, levels of wrestlers. We have wrestlers who've been wrestling for over 13 years. They're between 15 and 18 years old, and they've been wrestling for almost 13 years. Since they were 5 years old, they've competed. They are at the part where they are training to compete. I have other wrestlers who wrestled for 3 or 4 years, who are still relatively new to the sport, and they're at that next level down. And then I have some wrestlers who have never wrestled until this year. They've only been in for like 3 or 4 practices. I know that when I go in here to plan these activities, that I'm gonna have to plan for their developmental stage, not for everybody, but for each group as we go. And many times, as I mentioned you're going to have different stages in the same practice. And some of those times, you're going to have modified activities already built in. And I think that's an important part as you go through this, is once you've identified your stages, now you're making that practice plan, and now you're separating your practice plan based on which groups are able to do what. Now, that certainly requires more work on the coach's point, is because you walk into practice and you think, you know what, we're all going to do the same thing. But the reality is, not everybody in the room, in the practice room, can do the same activities, the same techniques, the same drills. And so we have to have modified activities. And that's such a critical part as a coach, is being able to modify those for that developmental stage. Probably 2 of the main reasons why I think this is so important is because as a coach, you're trying to maximize the amount of time that you have in the practice. You only have a certain amount of time with each of these athletes, and you want to get the most out of them. So by having these things planned out in advance, you're going to increase the amount of time that they're practicing. And that to me is a huge bonus. But it's also going to help you reduce the chance of injuries as well, because you're not going to be asking a wrestler to do something that they're not physically capable of doing. Because when we start progressing too fast, or we start asking them to do things that they're not technically able to do, then we put them at a potential for an injury. And I think that that's a critical part of in this process of when we're planning out our activities, and making sure that we have them properly developed for the developmental stage that they're in, and have those things all planned out in advance. So when we walk in, we're ready to go. We know what the plan's going to be. It's going to save us time, and we're going to reduce the injuries. The next part here is called reasonable progression, through techniques. So I think one of the things that we as coaches have to make sure that we are always looking at is this being done in a reasonable progression? That you're not taking something that's more advanced and immediately putting, newer athletes into those more advanced techniques. They're not ready for that. And so as a coach, you have a responsibility to teach things in what's considered a reasonable progression. All right. Coaches must teach even the simplest skills. It depends on what level your athlete's at. You can't take for granted that every athlete knows how to do everything when they walk into practice. And even as simple as learning how to fall properly is an important skill to learn. And we can teach those athletes how to do that, but we have to build that in to our progression. And I think the one thing as we're going through this, safety has to be considered in that progression, like how to fall. How many times have you seen an athlete that maybe falls back, doesn't know what to do? leans back and posts a hand backwards, and as a result ends up with an elbow injury. And had they been taught how to fall properly, they would know that. Also how to return an athlete to the mat safely is also another key skill. So I think that as we go through this and you're planning out your progression of your techniques and how they're going to go, you really have to have safety, in the forefront. Because when we start planning this and we put this also helps for the coaches avoid teaching skills too quickly as well. Like we're getting right into the most advanced skills. By having that properly planned out and having that safety in mind, we're going to build this in the right steps and in the right order to make sure that, one, they're not only learning it, but two, they're staying safe while they're doing it. By planning practices, this allows coaches to consider all steps that go into teaching the skill. And this will ensure that this is done in a proper progress. Teaching skills through a progression of steps could occur during one session or over a series of sessions. It doesn't all have to be done in one time. You can teach one part and focus on that one aspect in one session. Then in the next session, you come back and you could teach the next one. But by documenting all of these on the plans, coaches will be able to go back and review, when those skills were taught. And that's an important part of that, because as you go back and you start building in your practice, hey, have I taught this skill? Well, if you've documented this on your plan, you can go back and, yes, we did this. Let's go back and make sure we quickly review this before moving to the next part. I can tell you right now, one of the things that we're focusing on practice-wise is really just being able to move our opponent and move our feet. Like that's one thing that we're really emphasizing, and we stem everything from that process. So when we started our preseason workouts 5 weeks ago, we started focusing on just that, and we're slowly building off of those movements and then transitioning them into other things. We didn't start at the beginning by putting that, here's what we're going to do, and then throw them right into the most advanced things. We went back to the basics and focused on just how are we moving those athletes and how can we improve our footwork. And then we progressed into the next part of that. So we're kind of going step by step. And here's an example of this. If we take a look at the videos that we have up here on the board, on the screen here, you can see that we have motion. So here's an example of a wrestler just learning how to move his opponent from a collar tie. Snapping, moving, and turning. This is a key aspect of the move that we want to get to, because ultimately, down here in the bottom right corner, we want to get to a head snap, to a high crotch leg attack, to a double. That's what we want. We want to get to that point. But we can't get to that point but just saying, hey, they walked the door, here's what we're doing. We have to teach all of those other steps in that progression at some point in time in practices, whether it's all in the same one or whether we break it up over a series of practices. We have to make sure we implement these in. So one of those early ones is motion, just moving their opponent. Another key aspect of this is going to be the penetration step. Just being able to take that shot, and we're working on what are those key aspects to take that shot and to be able to score. Now keep in mind that this penetration step doesn't just go for this leg attack, but it goes for others as well. So by teaching them this skill, you're also helping them teach, for other techniques in the future. Then the next thing we can get into is that leg attack. Without the setup, without anything going, we're just working on strictly just the high crotch to the double. That's all we're focusing on. And we might even break this into part of breaking it into, I'm just going to wrap the high crotch first, the outside single leg attack, we wrap it, and then we do our finish. So we break these into steps, and then ultimately we get to the last step here, which is the snap, the release, and then the leg attack. So we're just putting these together. And I get that this is a very simple example, but this is the part of building in progression. And as a coach, we're responsible for that. Because when it comes down to it, if somebody gets injured, one of the things they're going to ask is, what were they taught in a reasonable progression? And by having these on your practice plans, you're going to be able to go back and illustrate that this was taught, in the steps that needed to be taught. Another part of reasonable progression is when we talk about conditioning. I think one thing about wrestling is it's a sport that requires you to be in great physical shape to compete. And the conditioning in wrestling is completely different than the conditioning in a lot of other activities. I mean, I could tell you, like, I'm an avid runner, and 2 weeks ago I ran a marathon. But I can tell you right now, I'm in shape to run a marathon. I am not in shape to wrestle. So that conditioning is a different aspect. But in order to compete, they have to be in great physical shape. But what we have to realize too is this has to be put into in a progressive order as well. That level of intensity should gradually increase over time. We don't walk in the first day of practice and say, all right, we're wrestling 4 matches today. Like that wouldn't make sense, because they're not ready to wrestle that. We're going to overtrain them very quickly. So we need to increase that level of intensity gradually over time. And I can tell you, right now we're in that preseason phase of our season. So we're not ready to. We're not starting our season yet till November. But right now we're doing workouts, and our workouts, we're progressively stepping up the intensity level and that conditioning aspect as we go. When we're doing some maybe stance motion where we're moving, we started off just doing 30 seconds. We did 3 goes at 30 seconds each. Now we're progressing to 3 goes at 45 seconds. Then we moved to 3 goes at a minute. So we're progressively moving up that conditioning level as we go. We haven't even got to the point where we started wrestling matches. We're strictly just working on the teaching aspect. We're working on specific skills that we want to improve in, and we're working on setting up a base level for our conditioning. So it's just not technique that we need to make sure we have a reasonable progression. It's also that conditioning and that physical exercise that we do needs to be also implemented there. One thing I would always encourage too is when you're developing this part is how can you build conditioning while working on other areas of practice? I am not an advocate of doing a lot of running when it comes to getting in shape for wrestling. Like I don't take my team, we don't go outside. We're not going to go run. We're not going to do a lot of that because I want to build their conditioning while we're doing things at practice. Because like all coaches, I have a limited amount of time that I can see them. And we can't practice multiple times a day, and throughout the course, we're limited to certain times. So I need to find ways to do both at the same time. So we'll have activities and drills that will built in that will also help work conditioning. And again, with that, we will build that in a progressive order so that we keep stepping them up, not throwing them right into the most difficult things right away. Another key aspect of when we think about risk management and the safety of the athletes, some things we really have to consider here are the warm-ups and the cool-downs. How are they warming up? And then once the practice is in, how are they finishing that practice? And so our warm-up that we should have planned into our practice should be something where it's going to help increase our heart rate and circulation, just get the blood flowing. Also, a goal of the warm-up here is to loosen the joints, prepare muscles, and getting them ready for activity. That's what we want to do in that process. And it's such an important part that you have this structured in to your practice plan. And we'll get into more details in a few weeks when we look at practice plan essentials of what are some exact things you can do. What are some different types of warm-ups you can do? There's not right or wrong answers with these. There's a lot of things that you can do, but it's key to make sure that you have a warm-up built into practice. And I would certainly advocate having a very similar warm-up from day to day. That way you don't have to spend a lot of time going through how that's going to be different from practice to practice. Another key part here, as mentioned, was cool downs. Is once that practice is finished, making sure that you are taking time to get your body back to a normal state. We want to gradually decrease the heart rate, get them back in, maybe do some stretching to make sure we're maintaining flexibility, but we're doing those things that bring our body back to that normal state we were before we had the activity. And some of the, one of the main reasons for these two things is really just to prevent injuries and soreness. Wrestling is a very physical sport, and certainly, there's injuries, there's going to be bruises, there's going to be things that occur. Some injuries, may prevent them from competing. Some injuries are just part of things they have to work through because there's just going to be some pain with that. And there's also going to be soreness, especially if they work out really hard. The next day they walk in, it's going to be a struggle. I know when I wrestled, I come from one sport, go into the next sport, And then I went in, and that first week of practice, my legs were sore. And I just got done doing a sport, but it wasn't the same sport. And so knowing and having that good warm up and having that good cool down will help work out and prevent those injuries and soreness. And I think this is also something that you really have to factor in with older athletes. Younger kids that are 8, 9 years old, like they very quick warm up and they are ready to go. Like they don't take a long time to get warmed up and get ready to move. They're very flexible as it is. But as we become older, we know that our body just doesn't quite operate the same as it used to. I know when I go in and I work out with wrestlers now just over the age of 40, it's difficult. Like I have to really get myself moving and get a good warm up in, to be able to wrestle with those younger athletes. So if you're working with older athletes, I would really encourage you to take time to really focus on what are you specifically doing with your warm-ups and cooldowns, because that planning part is really going to help reduce the injuries that may occur. Another area here is that I want to look at is looking at the number of participants versus your mat space. There's a lot of things in this process here as we go through this slide is a lot to think about, and how you can really implement these in to your practices, and really will help do a number of things. But it's going to make sure that you have the right kids matched up. You have a proper amount of space for the activities to take place. But these are things you have to think about in advance. So here are some questions that I want you to consider. Number one, how many participants will there be at practice? Like, that's a good thing to know. Like, I'd like to know right now when I walk in for our workout after school today, like, I know I'm probably going to have approximately 20, because I've had the same 20 for the multiple times. Now, that's important to know, because I'll structure practice for about 20. Now, when our season starts in a couple of months, I'm probably going to have in a range of between 45 and 60 wrestlers in the same space. So as a result, I need to know how many I'm going to have so I can plan effectively. Another question you need to consider in this process too is what level and size are the participants? Not only, what developmental stage they're in, but what age they're at, what age are they? Because some people, have practice. You might have, I did a camp not too long ago, a session where I had 13-year-olds and I had 6-year-olds. Like, that's a big gap in age. Not only are they at different levels developmental wise for wrestling, but they're also just different motor skills and different size. So we got to take a look at all of those things when we're looking at it, not just the number, but where are they at age and developmental level, and then what are the sizes of those athletes. And the next one here is how much space is there, on the mat. Like, do you have one mat? Do you have two mats? Do you have a half a mat section? Like, how big is your practice area? And you have to factor all of these questions in, because this is important, because you need to make sure that you give adequate distance and space between your wrestling groups. Because some activities, in order for them to finish and complete that activity, they need a safe distance to do that. I know when we're doing double legs, that when we do a double leg, it's going to take space for them to be able to finish. And by knowing all these, we can design a plan in advance that's going to reduce the risk of injury and maximize the amount of time during practice. That's ultimately what we want, but we can do this in advance. We can think about, we know what space we have. We know how many wrestlers we're going to have. We know what size those wrestlers are going to be. And by doing that, we can maximize, our time that we're going to have at practice, and also be able to eliminate and reduce the risk of injury associated with that by proper planning. And that's the part we really want to focus on here, is you can really reduce the amount of risk that comes with practice by simply thinking about it before you get there. So one thing I think you run into, some of your biggest challenges you run into, one is having a lot of participants in a small space, and then also having a wide variety of skills within that. So how do you think about that? What is something you can do that can help you, do those things we want? We want to get more practice time. We want to make sure that the athletes stay safe. So how do we do that? So here's a strategy. This is one that I use all the time. And this is probably, and I do it ahead of time. We don't walk in and we don't do this before practice starts. I do this before, as practice gets started. I don't look around and say, all right, what groups are we going to have? I've already pre-planned this. All right. So one thing I would encourage is if you know your wrestlers and you know who's there, is to place your wrestlers into groups. All right. I typically get them into groups of 4 or 6. Like that's typically my goal is to get them into groups of four or groups of 6. That way they have a practice partner. And then anytime I say, hey, find a new practice partner, like, all right, we're doing a drill, and all right, find a new partner. Now, because I put them in groups, there's no more looking around the room to figure out who they're supposed to go with, because that takes time. Like, so you're trying to maximize your time. Well, they're trying to find new partners. That doesn't go very well. All right. And inevitably what happens too, if you have multiple different size people in the room, is that the smallest guy or the smallest wrestler can't find a partner, and your biggest wrestler can't find a partner, and all of a sudden the only 2 people are left are your biggest and your smallest. Well, that's not going to work. So now you're spending time trying to rearrange them because you know from a safety perspective, those 2 can't go together. But by planning this out in advance and putting your wrestlers into groups of 4 or 6, when you say, find a new partner, they find somebody in their group. And because you have an even number, somebody's always taken there. All right? You don't have to worry about coming up with somebody who's missing. This is also important because you can put these groups by developmental stage. So if I've got my 4 best wrestlers who are in the same weight class area, I can put those 4 in a group together. And those 4 are just going to rotate amongst themselves. But that way, those 4 are always there. All right. And then I can put my younger wrestlers who maybe need different work. I put them in a separate group. And maybe they're in a group of 4 or 6, again, by weight. And that way, when we're rotating, they're rotating within that. That way, if I know if we do live wrestling, they're live wrestling within their group with somebody who's of comparable ability. Again, this is just being able to make sure that I'm keeping them safe and not doing something or wrestling with somebody they shouldn't be wrestling with. And again, by doing this, I'm also not only keeping them safe, but I'm also maximizing my time at practice, which as a coach, we know that's an important thing. Another part of putting them into groups is if you have limited space, you can have groups on and off the mat. So on the mat, we're going to have these groups, and they're doing this. While they're on the mat, you have the other groups off the mat, and maybe they're doing something different, but you already have them pre-planned as to where they're going to go. So this frees up space on the mat and still keeps those other groups working or doing something else, and then we rotate. You know, I know if we're going to go wrestle live, and live wrestling typically takes more space. Like if you're drilling, you can drill in a confined space. You can get pretty good at that. But when you're live wrestling, you could be anywhere. So you got to make sure you have ample space around them. So there'll be times where we take certain groups. All right, these groups are on the mat, and we wrestle for 2 minutes. Then while they're wrestling for 2 minutes, the other group is off. And then we rotate them. So 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off in that process. But that allows us to free up space as we go. So I think this is just a critical aspect of this part. And again, it's going to help you reduce injuries, and it's going to make sure you get people in the same groups, and it's going to maximize your time. This is one thing I'm a big proponent of, making sure you have this planned out before you walk through the door. Another key thing about this too, when we start looking at the number of participants and mat size, is sometimes we have to adjust drills so that maybe they're all going in the same direction. Like we have to think about that, and we document those things. We're documenting these things on our plan ahead of time, so that way we know when we get there, we're not going to run into this. As I mentioned earlier, I had a drill where we do a hip heist. We hip heist out, and then we fire a blast double. Well, if you do this with everybody around the room and everybody's all going different directions, it is inevitable that 2 groups are going to collide and land into each other. So now you're increasing the risk of an injury, and it's even an injury that's unrelated to the technique that's being done. You know, now we're potential of 2 wrestlers hitting heads that don't even see themselves coming because they're going 2 different directions. So by planning out what our space is, our number of participants, we can effectively plan out to make sure that we're all going in the same direction. For example, in that drill, like I take everybody down to one side of our practice hall in our room, and we line up 4 groups or 5 groups across, and we do a hip heist to a blast double, and they all go the same direction. So they work down the room. Once they've done 2, Then I will start the next group of 4. I guess it would be 8 or 10 wrestlers because they're partnered up. And they just work down the room. Now, yes, this takes a little bit more time than if everybody was just getting reps when they wanted to. But because of the safety concern with it, we have to be able to manage that. And you only know this if you have already calculated how many participants you're going to have and what does your mat space look like. Then you have to make adjustments. But again, these are all things that you can plan out as a coach that one will help reduce the risk before you even walk through the door. There's so much that can be done beforehand to reduce the risk because you have enough to worry about during practice, of those things. But if you can plan it out ahead of time, you're going to put yourself in better situation. Another thing we need to factor in sometimes as well, and I think this kind of goes, we forget about this a little bit, is factoring in temperature. What's the temperature at which you're practicing? Some people I know, worldwide, may not be in a climate controlled environment. They can't control the temperature where they're practicing at. They're at the mercy of whatever it is outside. So if they live in a very hot, humid climate, it's going to be hot and humid inside, particularly on some days, and maybe even train outside. Maybe they have an outdoor venue where they're training outside. Likewise, it could be whether it's warm or whether it's cold. These are certain things that you have to be able to consider. When the temperature is warm as a coach and you walk in, I've walked into practice room where I didn't expect it to be, and all of a sudden the room we were practicing in was really warm and really humid. As a coach, I have to immediately start thinking, this is a situation where I might have a heat-related illness, because of dehydration, because the athletes may dehydrate quick, and children are at a higher risk for this. So we really need to factor that in. And likewise, on the other side, if the temperature is cold, athletes are susceptible to muscle tears. They could pull a muscle, they could tear a muscle in the process by not being properly warmed up. And in another part we often don't think about too is you can still dehydrate and it's not even noticeable because it's so much cooler that you're still sweating, but it evaporates so quickly you don't even know that you're losing fluids until it's too late. But regardless of this, we're probably going to, we have to be thinking about this. If we know in advance that we're walking into these different temperatures, then we have to plan accordingly to make sure that we have a plan in place to reduce that risk. All right. Now, while we might be in potentially warm or cold environments, the likelihood is we'll probably be in a warmer environment more than we'll be in a colder environment. Yeah, I know I run into that often. I walk in the room and all of a sudden I'm like, why is it so warm in here? It's 25 degrees Celsius or higher in the room. And I'm like, this is not what it's supposed to be right now. But it is. So how do I deal with that if I run into that? And so if you take a look, this chart to the right, I think is just this is called, this chart, it measures the relative humidity and temperature. And this is called the humidex, which where I'm from, we call this the heat index. And this is really just a description of how hot and humid the weather feels to the average person. And it's a combination of the temperature and the relative humidity. So if you take a look at this chart, for example, let's say it's 25 degrees Celsius and the relative humidity is 70%. So you just follow it over and see where it intersects. So to the average person at 25 degrees Celsius and 70% relative humidity, it's going to feel like 32 degrees Celsius to them. So it's going to feel much warmer than what it really is. And this is important to note because based off where that is, we need to really consider what could happen as a result. So here's this next part. Based off of what that humidex value is, or that heat index, is really important to what we have to do. So if you look at the chart in the upper right-hand corner, what you notice here is depends on what the humidex value is, depends on the level, the risk level. If you have a humidex value that's less than 24 degrees Celsius, so when you match up that chart, it's 24 or less, that has a low to moderate risk level. Like there's not a real urgent danger that a wrestler or an athlete may overheat or dehydrate. If it's between 25 and 29 degrees Celsius, now you're getting into a moderate risk. It's a little bit higher, but it's not terrible yet, but it's something you need to consider. When you get that value over 30 degrees Celsius, this is a high in a somewhat dangerous situation to practice in. And we have to be cognizant of that because, it doesn't take very long for somebody to dehydrate. And as a result, they can end up with a heat-related illness. It could be a heat stroke, heat exhaustion. And I even know of athletes that have died in other sports because of heat-related illnesses because their body just overheated. All right, so we have to consider this. Now, when we have like these high humidex values, what are some things we can do? And here, I have a list of things. Here are some things that you really should consider. Number one, as a coach, you should plan in water breaks. When are you going to give them time to rehydrate during practice? It is important that you plan those into practice as you go. It needs to be on the schedule. One, for a couple of reasons. Like I mentioned earlier, it's easy to get distracted. If you see it on the practice plan, there's a good chance you'll stop, you'll take the break and allow them to hydrate. Two, by having this on here, it reduces your liability as a coach. Because I know that if an athlete would have a serious injury or a serious complication because of a heat-related incident, they're going to come back and take a look at what did I do as a coach to help prevent this? Was this something I could have prevented, or was it just something that just happened? It was just a bad situation that happened. But by having it documented on your practice plan, you're helping reduce your liability, along with being able to make sure you remember to give them those water breaks. Another part here is when you're going to have high values like this, is plan for lower intensity workouts. This will allow the participants to be able to do more longer, and stay hydrated during the course of that session. So if you drop the intensity level down, they're not going to sweat as much. So you can plan for some lower intensity workouts. And it goes into the next part too. If you're going to be in a high temperature environment, it is very difficult to sustain a long training session. Like you walk in and it is warm. I know right now, I am not going to get that much out of it. I'm either going to have to lower the intensity down, or I'm going to have to cut time out of the workout, because it's impossible to train at a high intensity level for a long period of time. Because in nearly every case, athletes will not replace the fluids as quickly as they're losing them. So we have to understand it, and we have to know that and make sure that we plan accordingly. One time I walked into practice at the last school that I was at when we were working out, and it was really hot. I walked in, I was like, oh my gosh, like we're not going to be able to get this room cool quick enough before practice is scheduled to start. You know what? I realized immediately we had about 45 minutes total. Like that's about how much we could work out before the quality was going to go down, the effort was going to go down, because they dehydrated quickly. We had a relatively intense workout planned, and I still wanted to do some of those things. So I still did the higher intensity, but I cut out half the practice time because they weren't able to sustain it. One other thing too, especially if you're in the part where you have to worry about the environments, the outside environments, is to avoid scheduling practice between 10 and 8. Those are typically the hot 10 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night, between 10 and 1800, because those are typically the hottest times of the day. And so if you're in an outdoor environment where you're practicing or training, like you need to realize that that's going to be much more difficult on them than if you wait till later in the day. Maybe after the sun goes down, the temperature drops, and then you have adequate time to practice. So if you can avoid scheduling during those times, that should also help with that temperature and humidity if possible. So these are just some things, and this is just some helpful hints and some strategies to think about. But really, I'm a big believer that most of our risk reduction in practice comes before you even walk through the door. Before you even start practice, you've already properly planned all of the activities. You've got it documented you have it documented on your practice plan. You've thought about all the different scenarios. So when you walk in, you're starting that this is going to be a safe environment for your athletes, And then all you have to do then is be able to manage that risk, as they're competing and or as they're wrestling. So I think that's a key part, but I'm a firm believer that you have to do this prior to even walking in. That's why I built this. This is why this is in this webinar series, is because when you're building training plans, this needs to be one of the first things you're considering. All right, now, kind of wrapping up as we go, if anybody has any questions, I'll certainly be glad to answer anything related to these topics, whether it's something that I've done or practiced, or if you have a question about what to do, certainly be willing to help there. Now, there's not too many of you here, so I imagine there's probably not going to be too many questions. Certainly, if there are, you're always welcome to reach out to me. I'll gladly share anything that I do practice-wise, and developing training plans. Developing training plans is probably one of my favorite things to do. Like building plans on how to be successful and what that looks like and how to implement things is probably one of my favorite things to do. So I spend a lot of time doing this, so if you ever have a question or ever have any, hey, what do you think about this, or what would you do here? I will certainly share anything that I have in this process. But wrapping up here, I think there are two quotes that I would really focus on here, and I think these are really good. Number one is that safety starts with awareness, and awareness starts with you. As a coach, I have to be aware of those situations, and then I need to, start thinking about that safety, and I have to be aware of it, but it has to start with me first. All right, first thing, and that's what we do before we even get to practice. We've got this in our practice plan. We're ready to go. And remember, as a coach, I think this sums all of it up right here. At the end of the day, the goals are simple. It's safety and security. Regardless of what we're trying to accomplish, with our wrestlers and what we want them to be able to do, at the end of the day, our number one goal is to make sure that we ensure the safety and security of our wrestlers and of our athletes. If we do that, the other things will take care of themselves, but our goal is to make sure that happens every time. Again, I'd just like to thank all of you for being here. So again, not a huge number, but I appreciate you taking the time to join in today. And certainly, feel free to reach out to me at any time, and certainly I'd be glad to help you, with any process this. Our next training plans that are coming up, we're going to focus on kind of what the theoretical framework is of the training plan. Like, how do I start with this theoretical framework, and then I build from there. Then the one after that, we'll get into practice plan essentials. Like, what are those actual things that are happening at practice, the different activities, the different ways we can drill. And we're just going to give you some examples of those. And then we'll kind of finish up this webinar series by how do you pull all of it together. So we've got 3 more parts that we'll be covering. The next time I'll be here will be in 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks on Monday at this time is when I'll be here. So hopefully you'll be able to join, and I look forward to seeing you. So take care. Have a great day.